Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to my Final Fantasy XIV Raid Retrospective. This is a series where we go back to the old raids and analyze the fights as they were at the time to see if there's anything we could learn to use in our modern raid scenario. The main motivation for this is because the most recent tier, as of the recording of this video, actually returned to some of its roots from the olden days, and even the developers have admitted to using certain older fights as inspiration for those encounters. So, we have been going through Coils, we've been going through Alexander, and for this video, we're going to be taking a look at what a lot of people consider, who were actually around at the time, the best raid tier that ever released, even to this day. There's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of really cool boss themes, and it was a challenge. So much so that it didn't really help with the problems that Gordius set before. It just kind of created new ones. All the same, let's go over Midas on the Savage difficulty. Now, Midas actually represents kind of a major turning point in my Final Fantasy XIV career. Up to this point, I had been doing hardcore world first progression, but my life was just getting too busy for that point. So Midas was the first tier I actually enjoyed at a more casual pace, not actually finishing it until pretty close to the next tier was coming out, in that of Creator, when I joined a group and we just went back and made sure that everyone had done and seen Midas so there would be no surprises when we went on to Creator. So it's a very different perspective of mine, and as such, I don't really have a lot of my own footage from way back when, so I am going to be referencing other people's group footage and maybe mixing in some of my solo footage, as I have gone back and soloed all of Midas, at some point or another, in order to kind of supplement my thoughts. It's too bad I had low item level Midas footage and I couldn't find it. I guess I just didn't save any of that low item level footage. Shame on me. So starting with A5, we can't start with the boss themselves, because much like with A1, there's another Faust situation here. Yeah, this was something they did throughout all of the Alexander series, gradually evolving the Fausts as they went along. For A5, instead of there just being one Faust with a bunch of little adds, they started with two Fausts. Gotta double the pain right there. But these two Fausts are actually just not even really the boss, because after you defeat both of these Fausts, a proximity AoE happens and then a Hummelfaust comes out. And the Hummelfaust is not too much more threatening. It really is still just a burn. He does some raid wides, he does a lot of tank busters, and it's not a terribly difficult fight. But still, after Faust was such a major wall for people, having another one was certainly a brave decision. Especially because when they were going into Midas, they actually had a specific goal in mind. Gordius had done such bad damage to the raid scene and to anyone's interest in it, that they said that Midas was going to focus less on DPS checks and more on intense mechanical dances. And this kind of goes against that entire philosophy. I guess that you're just checking people for the first fight to see if they're even good enough for that, but it definitely wasn't reassuring. And I promise you that will be a recurring theme throughout all of my talk about Midas. Now, the actual boss was Ratfink's Twinkle Dinks. Yeah, hard to take a boss with that name seriously, but it's actually a very unique encounter. It mixes the player being transformed into different creatures with a lot of ad control and just good awareness of the space. The main mechanic for this fight involves transforming into various creatures or using specific effects from the potions that are along the cardinal sides of the room. A player also needs to manually charge the device in the center, which will deal damage to them over time, in order to actually use the potion, so it spreads out the responsibility of the mechanic across multiple people. Transforming into a monkey allowed you to smack the round bombs so that they were away from the team, while the spiked bombs could not be moved. There was a bird to avoid a room-wide AoE. Then there was also one that could remove a tether that an ad would put on you so the tank could actually pick it up. And then there was one to get rid of a coagulant that was given to players from the snakes. Now, using a potion gave you a debuff that inflicted a strong dot if you actually drank too many potions or stood in too many puddles, or if the side effect actually ever wore off on its own. This was called the overgulp debuff. Now, this debuff got shorter and shorter with each potion that you drank. So by the end of the fight, given you have to drink the potions for several mechanics, especially the bird one where all 8 players need to drink it, it could get pretty spicy if players weren't deliberately stepping into potions in order to extend that timer. So it was actually it wasn't really the most intense thing. Especially after week 1, you rarely actually saw overgulp unless people accidentally stepped into things they weren't supposed to, but it was a nice little bit of additional pressure that doesn't really get a lot of credit when it comes to this fight. You also had to worry about the ads and the boss going over the potions. If any of them walked over the potion, they got a stacking damage buff. And also some of the potions could affect the bosses in particular ways. One of the ads you actually need to give the coagulant debuff, and if you step him over the thing that cures it, then it'll cure it and then he can't be killed. The boss, if they walked over the thing that breaks the tether and makes you invisible, would actually make the boss untargetable for a little bit of time. Boss doesn't change anything, but they still become untargetable, so that could make for a really bad situation in terms of boss awareness, because he becomes incredibly translucent, as well as giving the boss a damage stack and losing uptime on the boss that otherwise may have led to an actual clear. So I like all the little interactions that come with the potion mechanic. Now, on top of all that, there are tons of different ads. Many of them need to be stunned or killed quickly, and one of them even needs to be fed a snake ad to be given that coagulant like I mentioned earlier. The boss's direct mechanics are also pretty cool. He has two forms, a small goblin form and his big bugbear form. In the smaller form, he uses a lot more traditional attack. He aims AoEs at players, he does raid-wide AoEs, he throws poison potions, summons the ads, etc, etc. The big guy, on the other hand, has more brute force mechanics, a tank buster that requires the second tank to watch the animation to see if it's a line tank buster or actually a split damage AoE that he has to bring over to the party. He has a raid-Y that requires transforming into a bird, as mentioned earlier, a dash into a 180-degree AoE, just a lot of stuff that kind of feels strong, if that makes sense. This fight, to this day, in my opinion, is actually one of the best first fights we've ever seen. It's creative and fun, but it wasn't overscaled, and showcases a much more engaging theme with its mad scientist boss, even if his name is Twinkle Dinks, which I don't think I've ever gotten over in all of the years that I've played it. But yeah, really cool boss, and I would love to see more involvement in future bosses with things like this. Like right now, a lot of our bosses are very kind of static in the sense that the way that we manage them, how do I put it? If a boss wants us to handle one skill by using a debuff or buff from another skill, it's usually not left much up to the player how that's done, at least not nowadays. Whereas here, you kind of had to decide, when is the right time to charge the potions? If there's a raid-wide coming out, you don't want that person to be charging the potions at that time. When do we actually take the potions? How do we position the boss so that they don't go near the potions, or the ads don't go near the potions, etc.? Like, that amount of control over the arena is not something we have as much. Yeah, we had a fight where we could destroy the arena, or we had to be aware of the arena, but this is a lot more making the entire arena kind of a player controlled mechanic, and I really do like that and think that that can give us a really good feel. I'm not saying they should do a mad scientist boss again, but I'm saying thematically something similar would work really well. Everything else about the fight's pretty traditional. I do like the tank involvement, knowing that they have to at least watch one of two animations. There's lots of ads for them to pick up. And I think, again, with this most recent tier, we've seen that level of engagement is definitely desired amongst raiders. So I think that they should definitely take an eye at what made this fight work. And whether it's in a first fight, second fight, third fight, or fourth fight, it really doesn't matter. They should probably try to see what was popular about this fight and thematically kind of try to achieve that in another one, because I think this is just one that should be one for the record books in Final Fantasy XIV, and we should be modeling more fights after a similar kind of mold. Speaking of a unique mold, the second fight is the Robot Gauntlet. This fight has several standout mechanics for each of the individual bots, but it's actually a small 4-boss gauntlet that has one long form Enrage. You have to defeat each bot within that Enrage timer, and each of them has plenty of things that will definitely put the pressure on you beforehand. There's like mini DPS checks within that whole Enrage, and honestly, the whole Enrage wasn't even that big a deal here. The micro DPS checks were more problematic. Now, before I even get started, we ran into a big issue with this encounter on Midas's actual release. Gordius had promised that there wouldn't be as many DPS checks, and that's kind of held true here, but there's so many mini DPS checks here where burst damage is essential that a lot of players ran into some similar issues as they did with Gordius, but now on the second fight instead of the third. So we always used to make the joke, if Gordius made Raiders quit on the third fight, then Midas made Raiders quit on the second. And it was really, really bad. So much so that a month after it was released, this encounter in particular was actually nerfed. Now, this is foregoing the fact it also had a really major bug that was completely irrespective of any of the buffs or nerfs, but they did eventually fix that. But this was the last fight that was nerfed on content until Abyssos in Endwalker. We're talking about that level of kind of change that needed to be made. And the the nerfs that were actually done to the Robot Gauntlet were way more severe than the 1% HP change that came out of the Abyssos change. So that's the kind of legacy that Midas has, is it was supposed to make everything better, and instead it made everything pretty much the same, except players were now breaking their statics on the second fight instead of the third. Not a great legacy to have, even if the tier itself was actually very creative and fun. So as for the individual robots, the first one was Blaster. You know, the two main mechanics it had, mines and mirages. Originally, there were 2 mines, and you had to remember where they were dropped, and the tanks had to run over them and disarm them. They changed it to 1 because the 2 mines was a little bit too rough, because they did do tank buster level damage for the average player. So only the earliest groups really stood that much of a chance of getting through it. And then also just regular mines you had to avoid. Probably the more important thing that people remember it for is the Mirage mechanic. The Mirages would summon AoEs on players, and then shortly after, either all charge at a random player's direction or tether a player and either raise their hands or lean forward, signaling that the person either needed to look at or look away from the Mirage. The first Mirage was always the charge one, and honestly, that alone caused a lot of issues with people wiping. It was just really hard for a lot of players to subsequently drop all the Mirages and then bait them all in such a way that they could safely move out of all of their direction. It was more common that players just kind of dropped them randomly and just looked around and tried to avoid, even though that clearly didn't work either, and people got hit all the time. But it was just a lot to ask of players back in the Heavensward days. You also had to silence the boss to stop a raid wide from killing everyone. They nerfed that raid wide. They removed its paralyze. They made it non-lethal, and that made things a lot easier. But then it also had a mini ad phase where you have to kill 5 Mirages before they finished each casting a raid wide. The cast times were staggered, so you just had to find which one was casting first and then kind of go clockwise and then end with the one in the middle. I think it was always north, east, southwest, and then center in terms of that kill order, but all the same, it was just a nice little mini DPS check that a lot of people actually struggled with, especially if you had damage downs from the Mirages that were charging at people or deaths from the part prior to it. Yeah, this is already where people were not getting past. This wasn't the main part people weren't getting past, but it was definitely a bit of a wall for quite a few people, especially on release when it was scaled to be a little bit tougher. The second boss was Brawler, and this is where a lot of people ended up getting stuck for good, or actually breaking their statics. Basically, his main mechanic is he would transform its arms into various weapons. Single laser is a tank buster, double laser was a split damage line AoE, a single drill was a single target proximity attack from the boss on a random player, and the double drill would hit the nearest and furthest players with an AoE and would knock back and stun anyone other than those 2 players who were hit. Basically, it's just about managing all of that. There's some high tank damage as well to mix in with the batch. But that's really all it is for the first, minute or so. But then once you defeat him, he goes into a second phase where he basically just pulls energy balls into the center of the room, and your goal is to actually just survive and make sure that you don't die to any of the damage. There's small energy balls that acted as tank busters, and large energy balls that you actually had to use crowd control to force them to stagger so they didn't both hit the boss at the same time. You also wanted to avoid a lot of these explosions or attacks actually hitting at the same time as Brawler's actual attacks, because Brawler still did single laser, double laser, single drill, double drill, all that. All while buzzsaws were flying over and pulsing electricity into the arena with their game's really weird kind of server tick. So it can make it seem like you were way out of them, and you weren't. It was a very strict heal check, very strict attention check, especially because the boss's order of his hands, while he can only do one of them each time, was still in total random. You didn't know if you'd start with single drill, double drill, if you start with single laser, double. You didn't know what the exact order was going to be. You just kind of started to figure it out as he used them, since he couldn't use them more than once in this phase. Yeah, a lot of people got stuck. This is where people did not get past just because of the sheer demand of awareness that came from this entire little dance. And then you come to Swindler, who's known for enumerations and a unique mechanic, height. We have never seen height again after Midas, and it's kind of sad because I thought it was a pretty good mechanic. I would literally just see different platforms on the arena shift to higher or lower, and then you'd get a debuff telling you which one was safe to stand on. Players would just often not pay enough attention to height and die while doing other mechanics. So it made for a really good additional kind of attention check, individual to each player too. There was not like a roll requirement or whatever. You just had to be ready to do whatever your height was at any given moment. This was also one of the earlier places we saw enumerations. That's the debuff that requires exactly the number of people that it shows. This one can need 2, 3, or 4, so a prio system became the norm, breaking up into light parties and then doing, you know, supports for 2, supports plus melee for 3, and supports plus melee and ranged for 4. You could also use height during enumeration, so you had to make sure you were in your correct height while doing your enumeration, which means the enumeration person needed to be standing right on the edge of 2 of the platforms, so that way, but most of the time they would stand on like the center or like close to the center of like 4 different up and down sections. Just made it way easier for people to have options when it came to where they actually wanted to stand. The boss did some serious raid wide, and also there were a ton of goblin ads. For the most part, you just AoE'd them down, but you did have to silence one of the bigger ads to prevent buffs from being given to the smaller ones. There were also sniper goblins that every time they fired would deal more and more damage, so you had to deal with them very, very quickly as well. So yeah, just an overall, that was the good. I don't think Swindler is most people's favorite. Height is a favorite, but I don't think Swindler in particular is as remembered as Brawler, Blaster, or Vortexer, strictly because, well, they all had way bigger. Finally, we come to Vortexer, which used various elemental bombs that required precise positioning, both on players and on the arena. Players would be marked with compressed lightning and water spout. Both of them would explode upon wearing off, but they both had different effects. They also all needed to hit at least one other person, and then the debuff would hop to that other person. If one person ate it alone, which was technically survivable, then the debuff would reappear on them, and they would be considered a failure, and then they would just blow up the entire raid. Water Spout was a split damage AoE, so 4 or 5 players would be needed, but Compressed Lightning actually multiplies its damage for every person hit. So just one player, usually a tank or a player with water resistance down, would have to go to the person who was marked. Water Spout would also leave behind a Water Tornado that was basically the main mechanic, I would say, for the entire phase. It could be frozen with ice bombs to create an ice pillar, but if you step too close to it, it would actually tether people and blow them up, which could create, you know, just a cascading effect that wipes. So the ice bombs needed to know exactly how far of a distance was safe, which meant using the actual kind of markings on the arena was really important. And on top of that, you needed to then baby that thing, because if it wasn't alive when the boss casted Ultra Flash, then you were just going to be dead, and there's really nothing you could do about it. Maybe you could do a whole like res and healer LB3 thing if it was gone, if you had the timing right, but I don't think you really want to rely on that. The Water Spout's Water Tornado, also if not frozen, would just blow up after some time. So you also needed to be aware of when you needed to blow up the Water Spout and actually use the fire bombs that the boss would aim at random players. So you needed to have a somewhat kind of random, because it wasn't like all 8 players would get a fire bomb. So you needed to know amongst the players who were getting it, which one was aiming at the water tornado so that they didn't overlap and actually kill each other. It was a little chaotic, and it was definitely a really good cap off to a really solid encounter. It also meant that you had to have different positions for the water spouts, because you had to have one that was frozen, ones that were unfrozen, so you couldn't just go to the same spot. And the boss had a knockback that dealt a ton of damage, so you needed to be aware of that while taking the knockback, which a lot of people definitely struggled with. Yeah. Now, one of the problems with this fight in the early days, I mentioned a bug earlier, but I didn't really mention what it was. The water and lightning debuff, you know, they were supposed to hop to other players, but what was happening in the first, I think, like month or so is that they would actually just not hop to a new player. And that's, you know, the flag in the game to say that you didn't properly pass the condition, and then they would just instantly explode. So every pull, you'd have to wonder, oh, are we going to be allowed to clear? Because you get like anywhere from like 4 to 6 of these explosions in any given attempt against Vortexer, and it's at the very end of the fight. So it was an incredibly frustrating early time. We know that the World First definitely had to deal with that a handful of times. People who were competing had to deal with it a handful of times. And yeah, so this fight was just kind of a disaster for a lot of people. It's looked back on very fondly, both pre and post nerf. Even now, if you were to go do like a low item level challenge against it, you would find it pretty sufficiently challenging to manage. It's aged incredibly well. But unfortunately, when you've just come off of a raid tier where nobody could clear it because of the third fight, and now you have a tier where no one could clear it because of the second fight, and there's a bug that's causing even more issues for the groups that can get to the end of it. Yeah, this fight kind of encapsulates Midas not really being good for the raid scene at the time. It's like Midas was made at a time that the game wasn't ready for. And now we're at the point where we are, and we don't see these types of creative encounters anymore. So this encounter, through and through, is an idea that even if it was copy pasted into a new encounter, into something modern, I would absolutely love it. The ability to use the time in between the bosses as effective time in the encounter, such as knowing if you have vuln stacks that need to be dealt with. Can you wait for your, buff windows to come up? Can you wait for defensive cooldowns? There's all sorts of little extra things that need to be managed on top of each individual boss, actually being interesting and engaging. So this example is just at one of the very top spots for me to want to see another gauntlet style encounter like this. And then we move on to All Thoughts, who's realistically the big bad. I know it's Alexander, but this is kind of the goblin mastermind behind everything. And this is another encounter that every time I have the opportunity to go back to it, it's like a masterful balance of role responsibility and positioning under tight spaces. The arena's part of the fight, which is something we've talked about a lot in Raid Retrospective, and it's got mechanics that require pretty decisive precision and priorities. So there's just a lot to say about it. So there's spikes along the arena that inflict vuln up, which makes any damage you take while standing on them lethal, but they're not technically a death wall. So they act as sort of a mechanic throughout the fight where you can make measured movements through them between specific times. Even when doing spreads for AoEs, people will just walk through them while they have the bomb that's chasing them and go to one of the corners because it's way safer than trying to squeeze all 8 people into that center section. You'll do 4 people on the sides, 4 people in the center. It just makes things way easier. Even, these bombs that are chasing you, if you need to reposition them in any way, stepping out into the spikes and back in is perfectly fine. And there are some mechanics that 100% expect you to go into the spikes during a time that's actually ideal. So I really like the use of this ultra dangerous kind of hazard that is baked into how you have to handle the mechanics. The boss summons bombs on players that grant fire resistance down, which is both used as a spread mechanic and a means of endangering the player if they're targeted by kind of the main gimmick itself. So the big thing is that there are 4 specific cages that are, role-specific cages throughout the fight. And they'll spawn in the various corners, and they'll be flagged as, different things. Like, this will be a, this color is a tank one, and this color is a healer one. I'm colorblind, so I don't know what color to tell you, but I know that's how people did it. A tether indicates a player being pulled into one, while a prey marker designates the other. Both can be passed, and it's essential that any player who took bomb explosions kind of just not be involved in this cage mechanic at all. It requires a good priority system and careful movement because you have to make sure that the tether gets passed properly and is taken to the correct spot so the right person has it, while this prey marker is passed to the correct people, while actually starting to get ready for something else that the other, 6 people are going to be dealing with throughout the rest. There's ads that are going to be spawning. The boss is going to be stunning one of the people and then picking them up and dragging them over, and then people in the cages also have to be kind of kept safe. There are some mechanics that can be aimed at them. There's stuns that need to go out on the ads. It's kind of just like asking you to do everything for a really short period of time, and it happens a lot throughout the entire fight. And each cage has its own mechanics, so, depending on the role that you are, you're better suited for different ones. One of them you need to kill a slime real quick that's largely melee resistant. It's not unkillable, but on top of that, you can't actually take any actions until the outside group kills the padlock that it kind of forces you to have to stand still while you're in there. Healer needs to stand on a gas vent and heal themselves, otherwise the gas vent will, spew all over the arena and everyone will take damage over time. The tanks have to deal with a really hard-hitting boss that, they also have to actually kill. And there's soften ranges on all of these things, so you need to be really, really diligent about how you approach going into one. If you're weakened, if you're not, it's great. It's a lot of stuff going on at once, and I've always really enjoyed this phase. And the boss itself is still really threatening. It aims lasers that leave a damage over time on anyone they hit, so you need someone to bait it to a specific side and not hit anyone else. We mentioned the bombs earlier. Eventually spews flamethrowers at people, which means they need to stay away from anyone who's hit, but ideally it's just the person who's marked. And on top of that, if you die pretty much at any point, the boss gets a permanent damage buff. Let me rephrase. Back in the day, it was a permanent damage buff. Now it's actually a limited time, so it's possible to recover from deaths. I do think a permanent damage buff at any point in a 12-minute fight is not a great idea. I think that if you're going to do that, it needs to be punishment for a more specific mistake that leads to that, or it needs to be temporary. So that's actually a bit of a misstep. I definitely don't like permanent damage buffs unless it's meant, the failure condition is meant to 100% wipe the group. And this wasn't that. This was the boss is now stronger for the entire rest of the fight. Not unclearable, but stronger for the entire rest of the fight. And the boss is insane. It's insanely hard. In fact, whenever the boss does its raid wides, it actually gets a stacking buff that it only stacks up to 2. But it means that the boss can use their raid wides as a primary mechanic. Like, this is a boss that asks you to heal a whole lot. It'll put a laser dot on someone, end a flamethrower explosion on another person, and then hit you with 3 or 4 back-to-back room-wide AoEs while people are spread and taking bonus damage. It'll give people the dot and then a bomb explosion that happens at the exact same time. That means you need to really hard focus on healing and protecting specific people. It's probably one of the best ways to test a healer in the modern day is to go into a low item level version of this fight and see how they handle the pressure of all of the raid wides, because it is just so much damage being spread across everyone else. Funny thing, this permanent damage buff, or what used to be a permanent one, it occurs when someone disconnects as well. I guess as a means of preventing people from, I don't know, I guess from cheesing any specific mechanic, having them log out inside or get disconnected inside of a jail or something like that. I don't really know what the reason is, but it's pretty funny that in the early days, a disconnect would mean a permanent damage buff for the rest of the fight. The Tank Buster is nothing special, but it is multi-hit and has auto attacks in between, so it hits quite hard. You can choose to handle it in any number of ways. A lot of people just had one tank take all the hits, and each hit gives a stacking damage buff to, the person being hit takes additional damage. So some people would swap after it. Some people would actually swap in the middle of it, like, 2 or 3 stacks in, and then give it to the other tank. There were quite a few ways to handle it. That's usually for the better when there's more than one way to handle something. At least it makes the people doing the fight consider what might actually be the best. And probably the phase it's most known for is when the boss lowers all the spikes and a bunch of giant iron balls just roll around the arena. There's still lasers being aimed at people. Those flamethrowers start coming out. And everyone's just trying not to get run over by all these balls. Not to mention, the cat, Shinoa, shows up and tries to give the boss a heart that gives them the stacking damage buff from when people die. So you need to make sure that the boss stays separated from Shinoa anytime it meows. Keep it kited away from the heart. Make sure to heavy the heart, CC the heart, kill it before it speeds up and reaches him, because if it does, it is going to be a bad time. It's incredibly chaotic and busy phase, but it's actually one of the easier parts of the fight. It's just a really satisfying thing. The big thing is that the raid wides that come out while you're doing this, especially later in the fight, all this going on, and again, there's just raid wides everywhere. The raid wides are used as an effective mechanic throughout the fight. We very rarely just see an outright damaging raid wide used as a mechanic, and they used to do it a lot more back in the day. I remember when Shiva Unreal came out, and 4 back-to-back ice raid wides would kill unprepared groups. Like, you can make a raid wide an actual mechanic and have it be engaging in the fight for everyone there. It forces mitigation tools to be used more effectively. It forces the healers to consider what healing options they have for any given barrage of them, and without taking away from all the other mechanics you still have to do and heal through. The fact that the second half of the fight cranks everything up on these dials is also a really good scaling difficulty. There's a part where you have to have a person bait a flamethrower in the corner while the spikes are up, while the other 7 people do a ring around the rosy on the other side of the room. So there's a healer off on the side with the flamethrower, just like keeping themselves alive and just doing their own dodges. And the other 7 people have to deal with the tank autos and raid wides. And at some point between all of this, that flamethrower person usually comes over to the main group, and they need to start being a part of it, because you need both healers in one spot to keep up with everything. Again, the fact that they just cut the middle of the room completely off and force you into these corners just makes for, again, a really engaging experience. The big thing is that I don't think there's any specific theme that they can pull from this fight and use again. It's just a lot of really good and, quite frankly, not really seen anymore uses of all the most basic things. A tank buster that's got more than one way to handle it that isn't just a straight swap, or that puts a lot more pressure on the tank over time, that forces the healer to maybe be a little bit more engaged with the damage that they're actually taking. You have the arena, again, being a primary star, putting hazards on the arena that are actively there for large portions of time that are integrated into the actual mechanics. You've got people being sealed away doing their own mechanics, and that has its pros and cons. Sometimes sealing people away and making them do their own thing is not always a good idea, but we've actually started to see it a little bit more. In patch 7.3, we have 2 different encounters where that's a thing, where they seal the person away and say, hey, you are responsible for getting yourself out of the situation, and if you don't, it's going to negatively impact the other 7 people or the other 3 people in the case of the dungeon. So yeah, it's something that I think they actually want to lean more on. And the jail system has the people inside being responsible for the mechanic, so that if they do fail, everyone else has something to deal with because of them. Or if they do something incorrectly, it's going to affect the people in there, but the people on the outside also have to make sure that it's safe for the people on the inside. So there's that like interaction, and maybe that's why I've been a little critical of some of the seal away mechanics. They've been a little too, you're responsible for yourself and only yourself. And I definitely like it more when there's a little bit of cross interaction between the two. So that might be the one thing to take away from this fight, actually, is that if you're going to seal people away and force them to do a mechanic that kind of it directly doesn't allow you to interact with the other players, but there's mechanics in place that, you know, kind of force you to interact, that might be the kind of middle ground that I want. So that's going to be the one big thing I take away from here. But honestly, just a really fun fight overall. And then we come to Brute Justice. This is the game's unofficial first ultimate encounter. It's actually not that long of an encounter. Like, if we look at some of our tier 4 Savage fights, they are longer than Brute Justice is. I think the world first is like 13 minutes long, and, you know, compared to, you know, M4 and M8, which I think are like 14 minutes. You know, at the very least, it's a comparable length to that. But it has, you know, it's the first case of having a Savage specific phase, and the mechanics are very ultimate coded. And I think that'll make sense when you start seeing them. So phase 1 is against the Onslaughter. It's kind of like a mini manipulator from the end of Gordius. It has beams, it has perpetual ray, but it also has a couple of standout mechanics that were pretty tough for the very first thing you do in this fight. One is that it summons 4 regulators around the room that need to be burned down quickly. They tether the first player steps into the square, and then that player has to burst them down. So, you know, all 4 of the DPS usually. Check was kind of tight, so a lot of people had to save burst for them, which is really not something you expect to happen as one of the first things in the encounter. There's mega beams and ground AoEs you got to avoid, so the DPS are under a lot of pressure during the spot. And again, really early on is kind of scary. The more dangerous mechanic in phase 1, though, is Execution, where basically there's 5 orbs tethered to players, and then 4 players with a stacking debuff numbered from 1 to 4. You basically had to take damage to remove any of the stacks, so you had to get hit 4 times if you had 4 stacks, 3 times you had 3 stacks, etc., etc. So you'd have to go around popping the orbs in such a way that you could resolve all of these numbers, but the orbs actually dealt more damage the more people they hit. So you couldn't just send like 4, and you couldn't just like stack everyone and then have them go orb to orb and then settle it. And you couldn't take your own orb. So it really needed a tight priority system where specific numbers needed to detonate specific other orbs. So you needed to be aware of what your number was, what numbers you needed to pop, and who those orbs were actually tethered to. So a lot of arena awareness on top of mega beams and ground AoEs. It actually made for a pretty tough time for a lot of people right at the start of the fight. After that begins a gauntlet version of the robot gauntlet from A6. So all those bosses return, and you have to deal with them at the same time, or at least in groupings. If they're ever all in the arena at the same time, it's actually considered a wipe. They just instantly clean the arena and you just die. So it starts with the pair of Blaster and Brawler. Brawler's locked to the center, but a tank still needs to pick them up because they do auto, while the other tank and the rest of the party just destroy Blaster as quickly as possible. It's important to make players aware of Brawler's arm transformations, so assigned players can handle things like Double Drill or the stack that, you know, Share Beam. The tank needs to make sure to actually aim it at the rest of the party. All the other bots also need to be kept out of that giant circle that Brawler summons, because that'll buff him if anyone's inside of it. Now, when Blaster gets 50%, summons a clone that gets pulled away by the Brawler tank while everyone finishes off Blaster and silences his Mind Blast attack. It's usually not that big of a deal. Most people have no issue getting past Blaster unless there's some sort of aggro issue with the ad. But you have to be really quick about it, because Swindler pops up pretty quickly after this happens. So you end up with 3 bots on the arena at the same time, and taking 2 bots at once can be dangerous for any tank. So it definitely becomes noticeable when you don't have cooldowns to deal with the constant slappings that come from these things. Now with Swindler around, height starts happening. So every mechanic for the rest of this phase, you pretty much need to be aware of height at the same time. On top of that, you really need to be careful about their HP, because whenever any of them hits 50%, they're going to do a bonus mechanic. When Brawler gets to 50%, he initiates that orb phase from after he dies in A6. You know, the tank takes the small orbs, you got to stagger the big orbs. So you now have, by this point, you probably have the remaining bot. You know, Blaster's dead, but you should have Swindler and Vortexer, while Brawler has these tank orbs that are going around and the AoE explosions from the big orbs. On top of that, you usually have heights still coming out about this time, and one of the tanks is being slapped. It's a lot. It's a lot to ask of people, but fortunately, that part's not really too bad. You then have Vortexer and Swindler on the arena, and you usually finish Brawler off at this point. Now, you need to immediately split up Swindler and Vortexer, because now Swindler has the AoE that buffs, so you need to make sure they're separated. And then most people try to, like, stagger their 50% pushes, so, like, you get the bioarithmetics from Swindler, which signals the second phase, before you get the Super Cyclone from Vortexer, which signals his second phase. But you end up having to do heights, enumeration, bait fire bombs, and you also get the compressed lightning debuff, which needs to be usually only jumped to another player a single time. And all that requires careful timing, because the timing of the mechanics relative to each other is going to depend on when you actually push them at 50%. So I had a pretty precise phase push timing to have a generally easier time. So you didn't get something like a compressed lightning pass at the same time as an enumeration, which obviously would have been a disaster. But once you balance all that, you get that done, bam, you're only like 4 minutes into the fight or something like that at this point. And now you have to contend with the actual encounter against Brute Justice. All 5 of the robots combine, one of the favorites in terms of animations, in terms of, going into a fight, just thematics and the way the phase transition happens. But this part becomes a really, really tough encounter pretty much immediately. It was already tough before that, but now it gets, taken to another level. He's got a bunch of traditional stuff. He's got like a tank buster cleave, a double tank buster, a few basic mechanics. But there's one mechanic where he gives 2 players a spread prey marker and then another player a stack. And there's just explosions everywhere. There's raid-wide damaging happening at the same time. There's baited AoEs on the ground. The 2 spread players need to get away from each other. And while everyone else rotates into the same spot. And while all of that visual clutter is happening, he just turns and starts aiming a beam at people. That can sometimes be really hard to see. So using a lot of the visual clutter here in order to actually, make people kind of panic works really well. Then honestly, after that's done, he's kind of pretty tame for a little bit. He just kind of jumps away, does, like a conal AoE that he channels in a direction. It's easy to bait and then, get out of the way of it. And then it becomes, the tanks do a few more tank mechanics. There's honestly nothing too crazy there. But then it goes into why the fight gets its kind of mini ultimate reputation. And there's a downtime phase. There's nothing for you to hit, but all of the bots come back and they all do kind of like a combination of mechanics. And to this day, it's still one of my favorite downtime phases that we've had. You'll have mirages that you need to, spread and then bait them so that way their dashes go in a specific direction, while buzzsaws fly across the arena and a mega beam comes from Onslaughter, and there's fire and ice bombs coming from Vortexer that need to be dropped and gotten away from, all while you have to be considering height at the same time. And then there's tanks dealing with the single drill, or there's a double drill mechanic at the same. There's a lot that goes on during the downtime phase. I think I'm mixing and matching some because there's 2 separate downtime phases, and the second one is one that usually absolutely kills people. There's a part where there's like blaster mirages that need to be baited on the ground, and then they do the tether where you have to look at or away from them while there's buzzsaws going out and a mega beam to avoid. And people get hit by that all the time. There's one where you need to do enumerations while hiding behind the Onslaughter's legs to line of sight the Ultra Flash from Vortexer. It's great. And any mistake that leads to a death gives Brute Justice permanent damage buff. That, again, I think that's a little bit much, just because you could feel really good. Again, they probably just didn't want people cheesing and sacking in order to get through the phase. So I think there's some merit to it here. but I'm not going to act like it's not frustrating when one person makes a mistake. You're like, well, I guess Brute Justice will just be whatever, 10% stronger for the rest of the fight. Minimum 10%. That's if one person dies, you know? But yeah, really, really good downtime phase. And this is really where it gets its ultimate. But that's not the only place it gets the ultimate thing. It's also the first time we had a Savage exclusive phase, in that after the second downtime phase is done, Brute Justice goes back to full HP, sprouts wings, and then you have to do like one final like combo phase with full uptime against him. And that's really where the pressure gets put on. The big thing is that there's two major mechanics. The first one is Verdict, and it's just like a cracked up version of Onslaughter's mechanics. Two players get marked with Nisi, and then they have to go kill their respective steam regulators. You have 4 of those explosions during the execution phase with the orbs that are chasing people. There's 4 tornadoes that drop people to 1 HP, and you have a ton of debuffs. And basically, Brute Justice just asks you to meet conditions by the time he casts Gavel. Like, this person needs to make sure they have 3 debuffs when they get to Gavel. This person needs to have no debuffs when they get to Gavel. And so that means that you basically have to do whatever you're kind of assigned to do. You have to unravel that and figure out what everyone needs to do. It's a very traditional mechanic by today's standards. It's fun, but by no means is this really that different from some of the more insane dances that we have to do with debuffs nowadays. This is relatively, I'm not going to call it tame, but we're used to something like this at this point. So it's not really that big of a deal. Link Up usually gets people a little bit more. It's basically a combo attack that utilizes all 5 bot skills, but again, with full uptime. Like, Brute Justice will do a punching attack on the tank, followed by a baitable dodgeable conal AoE, but then instead of a Mega Beam, he'll do Final Beam, which is actually like Blaster's double arm cannon instead. Then does Prey Markers plus the Stack Marker, but throws a Brawler Mine mixed in. And then he'll have Buzzsaws going off while you have both Swindler's Enumeration and Vortexer's Compressed Water debuff, or whatever the Water Spout debuff is called. He then does a Mega Beam and jumps at a player, and then finally the tank needs to aim Brute Justice's Flamethrower at the Water Spout to disable it like you would have with the Fire Missile back in A6. It's one of the tightest movement awareness and mid-heal checks in a very short period of time in the entire game. And it's very, very easy to lose people at this point and just not be able to continue on. Does another Punch Spray Beam combo, and then just goes into an Enrage, and it's one of, you know, old school Raiders' favorite Enrage sequences. J-Waves, just party burns him down for like, you know, 35-40% of his health, while he does Raid-wise, they get consistently stronger. And this never ends, mind you. It's not like the usual ones where, you know, oh, after like 8 J-Waves, he'll cast the Hard Enrage. No, there's a Hard Enrage going the whole time, the steam cleaning. So as soon as it pops up on your screen, you know, you will be steam cleaned in 10 seconds. But if you handled the earlier phases faster, you have more time at the end. It's not like a, you know, this last phase specific timer. It's for the entire thing from the moment you pull Onslaughter. But the longer you have in the Enrage just means the longer you have stronger and stronger J-Waves to deal with, and that's not really a comfort. It meant that the Hard Enrage was very rarely an issue, which I guess technically meets what the developers were saying, that it was going to be a lot more about mechanics than DPS. But J-Waves is so threatening on its own that odds are you don't want to have to do them for that long anyway. So, yeah, there's just a lot of first time. I feel like Brute Justice has already been modeled a lot. We don't see as many Gauntlet-style fights, but a Gauntlet-style fight's not too different from seeing, like, an ad-centric encounter. I think that more than anything, it just ties together themes from the different raids a lot better. It acts as a rematch against an encounter you already did 2 encounters ago, so your game knowledge and anything that you were able to extrapolate from those really helps you here, which I think is something that's definitely lost on most encounters in Final Fantasy XIV. I think it forces you to think about those mechanics differently, so even though you've done those mechanics before, they're just very different under the conditions this fight puts you under. And then, but then, you know, things like downtime phases or, you know, some of the mechanics we've seen them so many times at this point that individually Brute Justice doesn't really do anything that's like that off the wall. You know, we have debuff dances. We have, you know, a lot of super precise mechanics nowadays, especially in 4th tier Savage and Ultimate. So Brute Justice, it kind of just exists. It's just kind of a cool fight that exists. You know, it's one that you can easily rank amongst modern encounters, and see how demanding it is. And that might be the only thing, is that especially for the days of Midas, that Brute Justice was more demanding on the player than most fights that came later, most raid tiers that came later. And so players looking for that kind of experience will usually rank Brute Justice a lot higher. And if you haven't done it, again, I do highly recommend finding the low item level, spreadsheet and giving it a shot, because it is a really, really good encounter, especially if you're looking to prog something that you've never done before. And if you want to test yourself as a healer or just your mitts in general, because, yeah, it'll mess you up. So it's crazy to think that a tier that you hear me and my voice, yeah, I'm clearly giving it glowing praise, right? I think it was just, it came out at the wrong time. Final Fantasy XIV and Heavensward, if you think Dawn Trail's rough, on-content Heavensward was among the toughest times for Final Fantasy XIV players. The game would not survive that nowadays. A raid scene that literally couldn't be done. There just wasn't the tools for it, and the player base wasn't good enough to do it, and it was asking a lot of the players at the time. A bunch of content that just didn't work out, that was reworked, that resources went into. Honestly, the fact that we had, multiple dungeons per patch was kind of the only saving grace of Heavensward, funnily enough, looking back, because it was constant miss after miss after miss until really like 3.4. Like Deep Dungeon 1 to 50 came out in 3.3, Thornton, Diadem, some cool encounters, don't get me wrong, but, the Sephiroth wasn't going to save all the patches, and Nidhogg, as cool as it was, wasn't going to do the same either. So Midas basically making it so there once again wasn't a raid scene for 9 months, because all of the casual to mid-core statics just broke up, or most of them did. It was a lot of damage done. So it's hard to speak positively of Midas without also acknowledging how bad for the game it was at the time it came out. But almost all of the ideas there are ideas that we've seen something like it, or we as players are better equipped to deal with them now, either in experience or in what our jobs are actually capable of. And as such, I feel like the return of Midas would be a grand thing. I'm not saying Midas Unreal or anything like that, although I'm sure some people would like it. But a lot of the ideas, just quite frankly, kind of lazy way recycled, I think would make for really engaging raid tiers. Give us gauntlet style fights. Give us fights where the arena is a lot more flexible like it is there. Give us more of a lot of what we got in Midas. We're better equipped for it now, and I think we can do it. So sorry that you weren't appreciated by many at the time, Midas, but you're remembered fondly by those of us who did do it. And hopefully you can instill that same memory on some other people if we get. And that is going to be a wrap for my raid retrospective on Midas. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe. We have one more raid retrospective left at the moment for Alexander, and that of the creator. We will probably go do Omega after that, but we shall see. But anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. And until then, take care.